Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 31 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Shout out to my patrons this month. That's Josh Bald, Michelle Cruz, and newest patron, Utuk Zul. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Thanks for your support. I truly appreciate it. If you'd like to join that support team, go to patreon.com/welcome to Geektown. It's just $1 per month, and as my way of saying thank you, I provide audio outtakes, full scripts, and other bonus content there. So check it out and join the Geektown citizenry. On to this week's question, which comes from one of our patrons, specifically Josh Bald. He wrote me and said, I'm curious if you could do an episode on RPG-style board games, past and present, and where you would suggest one would get started. I have fond memories of playing HeroQuest when I was 12 to 13 years old, for reference. Well, Josh, consider your curiosity slaked, as here is that episode. These RPG-style board games are most often referred to as dungeon crawlers, and that's the term I'll use most often. One of, if not the earliest of the dungeon crawlers was simply named Dungeon. Yes, it has an exclamation point at the end of its name, so you have to say it like that. It was released in 1975, just 1 year after Dungeons & Dragons was first published, and it came from the same company, TSR. In fact, the designer, David R. McGarry, was one of the players in the original Blackmoor campaign, around which D&D was designed. Dungeon was more like a standard board game than most of the dungeon crawlers we'll be discussing, in that it was every man for themselves. Each player enters the dungeon and tries to defeat monsters to earn treasure. The first to accumulate treasure equal to or above their goal and exit the dungeon is the winner. However, one major mechanic set it apart from most board games of the time, and that's asymmetric play. Instead of each player having the same powers and the same amount of treasure as the goal, some characters were more easily able to defeat stronger monsters, which gave out better treasure, but that was balanced out by those characters needing more treasure to reach their goal. And since the dungeon was split up into levels with weaker monsters on top and stronger monsters below, there were different strategy options for each character class. This is still a fairly simple game, closer to Monopoly and Sorry than it is to most modern board games. However, it's always important to recognize the progenitors of any given field, if only to appreciate how far it has developed. The game continues to be reprinted, with the newest edition as recent as 2014, although the rules have changed very little since its 1975 inception. One of the most popular games in this style came out 8 years after Dungeon, and has been updated to different editions over the years, just as RPG games themselves have been, and even has an app adaptation available for tablets and phones. Talisman, first published in 1983, is now on its 4th edition. Again, each player is on their own, trying to accumulate enough power to safely reach the center of the board, where they can use the Crown of Command to defeat the other players. Talisman also had asymmetric play, with some characters being better at physical combat, while others could cast spells from the very beginning of the game to help them defeat the monsters and other obstacles, or other advantages. Talisman was the first board game I ever found that had expansions available. Similar to DLC for video games today, you could add to the game with new character classes, monsters, and other mechanics by purchasing an expansion box, like Talisman City, Talisman Adventure, and even Talisman Timescape. The big mechanic that Talisman borrowed from Dungeons & Dragons and other RPGs was the improvement of characters through XP. As you defeat monsters, you collect experience points that can be spent to improve your strength, allowing you to defeat stronger monsters. You can also find or buy items that improve your other stats. The biggest issue that most board game players have with Talisman is that there is no upper limit on these stats, so often games go on too long, as players continue to build their character up long after they're ready to handle the inner dungeon and reach the Crown of Command. There's also very little to balance out when one player takes an early lead. In fact, that often is compounded, leading to games where the winner is obvious early on, but not reaching the actual conclusion until hours later. Even with those issues, Talisman is still an incredibly popular board game, and I have many fond memories of playing it with my friends at 12 or 13, just like Josh remembers HeroQuest. Speaking of HeroQuest, let's talk a little bit about that game. Right after this. There are a lot of ways you can listen to Welcome to Geektown. But did you know that you can actually get paid just for listening to this, or almost any of your other favorite podcasts? I recently found out about this free app called Podcoin, and it literally pays you to listen to podcasts. Here's how it works. You listen to podcasts, and you earn Podcoin while you listen. Then you turn that Podcoin in for gift cards at places like Amazon or Starbucks. Or if you're feeling generous, you could even donate that Podcoin to charity. The more you listen, the more you earn. Just download the app right now on iPhone or Android and use the sign-up code GEEKTOWN, and you'll get 300 bonus Podcoin just for signing up. Keep listening, and eventually you'll earn enough Podcoin to get a cappuccino at Starbucks or an Amazon gift card worth a few bucks. So go ahead and go listen to this podcast on Podcoin and sign up with the code GEEKTOWN. Thanks. And now, back to the show. Released in 1989, HeroQuest from Milton Bradley is arguably the most successful of the dungeon crawler games from the major board game manufacturers, although that may be because they worked with Games Workshop, who released the first 2 editions of Talisman. One of the things that set this game apart from the previous dungeon crawlers I've mentioned was that it was a one versus many game. Like the role-playing games it emulated, one person acted as the game master and controlled the monsters, traps, and other obstacles, while the rest of the players all worked together to overcome those barriers to their ultimate goal. This shift towards more cooperative play is something you'll see in almost all dungeon crawlers from this point on. In addition, the scenario book in HeroQuest provided different options for what the goal was each time you played, making each game feel very different from the previous one, and adding story and narrative, giving even more of an RPG feel to the board game. Speaking of RPGs, it's no surprise that the granddaddy of role-playing game companies jumped back into this field eventually. And so in 2010, we saw the release of Dungeons & Dragons Castle Ravenloft, a cooperative board game with rules loosely based on the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. If you've heard episode 20, you may remember that 4th edition is the red-headed stepchild of the D&D rule sets, but it works really well in this board game style of play. There have been half a dozen games in this series. Rather than expansions that require a core game, like Talisman did, the D&D board games each stand alone as a complete game. But the components of each set can be used in the others, or combined together to add more diversity to the games. Like HeroQuest, there's a scenario book in each box which can be used to emulate a full campaign over multiple game sessions, adding those story elements to bring it closer to an RPG experience. Another important development in dungeon crawler games came from Descent: Journeys in the Dark, published by Fantasy Flight Games. The basic mechanics of the game were actually re-implemented from a board game based on Doom, the classic first-person shooter video game, but was more successful with this fantasy overlay. Originally, it was released in 2005, with a second edition coming out in 2012. Expansions are available for both, and there was even a small set that allowed you to convert your first edition pieces to the second edition rules. Like HeroQuest, this was a one versus many game, with one player acting as the overlord, trying their best to prevent the other players from defeating the monsters and escaping with their lives. However, in 2016, Fantasy Flight released a free app called Descent: Road to Legend. This app provides multiple campaigns, with the option to purchase additional ones, and acts as the overlord during the game, telling you where to place monsters, obstacles, and other pieces, and increasing the difficulty in other ways as the game progresses. This allows the game to be played as a pure co-op game, which is my preference. Other games, like Mansions of Madness and Imperial Assault, have joined this trend of app-run game masters, and many other games have apps available to help keep track of different aspects of the game, as they've become more complicated over the years. They're quite helpful, and I'd recommend checking out the App Store or Google Play for available apps when playing any of the dungeon crawlers out there. Personally, my roommate and I, occasionally with others, played a few campaigns of Descent and enjoyed the game quite a bit after the release of the app. At least, that is, until the release of the final game I want to talk about. Just 2 years ago, originally funded by a Kickstarter, game designer Isaac Childress released a co-op dungeon crawler game called Gloomhaven. While not a true legacy game, check episode 5 if you're not familiar with that concept, Gloomhaven has some legacy aspects, like making permanent changes to the game and unlocking new characters and abilities as the game goes on. It's designed to be played as a long campaign with the same group of players, as you work your way through the story and secrets of the town of Gloomhaven and the surrounding wilderness. In between each adventure, you can come back to town to purchase upgrades for your character, or retire him or her and create a new character to join the party instead. Events in the town and on the road also affect your party in helpful or inconvenient ways, making the next scenario easier or harder than it would otherwise be. While there isn't an official app for running the monsters, it's not necessary, as their actions are randomized by a small deck of cards, one for each monster type. These decks make it so you can know the general strategy of the monsters you're going to be fighting, but not predict their exact move each turn. There are apps available which are sanctioned by Isaac, the game's creator, that emulate those decks and keep track of other aspects of the game, which help reduce the amount of cardboard out on the table, saving space for the sometimes quite expansive dungeon tiles. Upon its release, Gloomhaven quickly vaulted to the #1 spot at BoardGameGeek.com, the IMDb of board games, and has rarely dropped from that spot since then. My friends and I played all the way through the campaign, which took us about a year and a half of playing an average of about a scenario a week. Sometimes we played 2 or even 3 scenarios, while other weeks, other commitments prevented us from playing. And we're looking forward to playing the next campaign when we get a copy of the first expansion, Forgotten Circles. I simply cannot recommend this game highly enough. It's an expensive game, retailing at over $100, but for the amount of gameplay and fun you get out of it, it's definitely worth it, if this sounds like the kind of experience you'd like to have. Now, there are literally hundreds of games out there that could be put into this category, but I hit some of the big ones, and I hope that gives you a few ideas on some games to try out, Josh, and any other listeners interested. If you feel like there's something important I missed, let me know. Or you can ask questions you think would make a good topic for a future episode. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcometogeektown, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, "Welcome to Geektown, population, us." Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended. Follow me.